Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
In Sensing the New Myth, we're going to be speaking with artists, storytellers, musicians, and mythologists that are committing themselves to sensing the emergent art and myth in culture, rather than maybe clinging on to a dominant narrative or story, allowing themselves to be stewards of what is a more beautiful world, what are more beautiful stories, and how do we live them. And I've been inspired by Peter's reflections that beauty is found in communitas, and that here at the Stoa, with my fellow comrades and sense makers and artists and experienced designers, we are endeavoring to seduce the culture, as Peter puts it, into creating a more beautiful culture, to living a beautiful story. And that's really what I am feeling inspired by in my experiences here with you all, is developing community for the long haul. Like I want to, like some of these connections and relationships that I'm making, I really want to be committed to the long game of our relationship and what it is that we're creating together and experiencing a more rich mythology. So that's why I've called the series Sensing the New Myth, as I'm wanting to sense into what is an artful expression that wants to happen through me that will beautify the world around me. And so, Andrew, I would love to hear from you some of the thoughts at the edge of your thinking, like what is beauty really? And how have you been reinventing it for yourself lately?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Tyson. And thank you, I think it was Timothy, you said beauty is your compass or your core. And I think that's just absolutely perfect. That's absolutely, I feel the same way. I feel that beauty is the compass and the core, not just my compass in the core, but the compass in the core. So I think that's exactly right. And I also agree with, was it Jordan who said that, we're no longer up to the task. Like the culture is falling apart, and this is why there's so much ugliness. So I'm just gonna ramble here a little bit about, my thoughts on beauty, and also the denial of beauty. And I'm gonna start with that, because I don't think we can understand beauty unless we can understand what beauty is not. And I should also say that this conversation, the genesis of this conversation, comes from some discussions I've been having with John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro on my podcast. They've inspired me to think about this subject. And also Peter, who posted something from this wonderful Korean philosopher named Han. I can't pronounce the first part of his name, but called not Reinvented Beauty, called Saving Beauty, right? And so I read this, and this inspired this article, which is why I was invited here. So it's interesting how all of these people have contributed to this, the genesis of this conversation already. And one of the things that me and John and Christoph were talking about was there's this chorus always, right? And there's this chorus of voices, in our minds and all around us. In classical theater, you have a chorus, and the chorus is informing you, and the chorus is creating, is coming through you. So it's never you. Like beauty is not an isolated event. It always has a chorus. It always has a chorus behind it, if that makes any sense. So first, I want to just talk about what I think beauty is not. And what is the denial of beauty in our culture, and the hijacking of, let's say, beauty to be something else, entirely. So Hegel has this term called the beautiful soul, and he did not mean that in a flattering sense. He meant that as in a sarcastic, sort of insulting sense. He says somebody who's a beautiful soul is really, He meant that this person was not really in touch with something. They were faking it. They were putting on a front or a persona, or a moralistic, interpretation of beauty. So they were faking this kind of beauty. So that's the beautiful soul, and the beautiful soul is actually a kind of it's like a kind of ugliness, because beauty is not just being pretty or being cute or being nice or not this facade or this sexiness. It also has to have rough edges. And one of the things that Hans says in his essays, he talks about smoothness, how this culture interprets, beauty as being smooth, the smooth, right? Whereas actual beauty is a bit rough. It has rough edges, I would argue. It's not just pretty. It's because there's some gravity, because there's some depth, because there's not only light, there's a contrast of light and darkness. There's not only life, there's the meditation of death. You can't have beauty that is divorced from, let's say, the dark or the lunar or the sadness or the tragic or that kind of thing. So beauty is also involved in the tragic aspect of life, as well as being the vital and celebratory aspect of life. So I think what's not beauty is the smooth, and I was thinking the product. When something becomes a product, it loses, for me, its sense of beauty, because beauty is a unique instance. It's something that appears from nothing. And I made this little list, and on my list I had beautiful souls, cuteness, the smooth, the product, and then I had pornification, which is a word I learned from Alexander Bard. And I don't mean just porn, I mean the total pornification of the culture. And this means that everything becomes a sort of porn. Everything becomes something to consume, as quickly as possible, something that we can just, devour. So by porn, I don't mean, what sex workers do. I mean the news feeds. I mean the social networks. I mean porn is like selling what's precious of yourself to a big monster. Like your feelings to the social networks. And generating cash from that. There's something very ugly about that, right? I also wrote ideological possession. People who are possessed by ideology, you just look in their faces and there's an ugliness that pervades them, because they're right. They know everything, they're in possession of the one truth, and therefore they lose their connection to reality, to beauty. One thing also that I thought is a denial of beauty is jargon. We see a lot of in these communities, there's a lot of jargon pops up, a lot of technical language which people use in a way that it becomes a sort of in-group signifier. And there is something about creating language in a community which is a form of beauty, but then there's also the attendant jargon. And I think people could work on language a lot to make their expressions more powerfully beautiful. I was thinking of game B, and I was thinking that's an ugly term. It's a beautiful idea, but it's kind of an ugly term. It's a placeholder term. So that's just a thought. Jargon. Another thing I wrote was fragility. When people are overly fragile about everything, and they don't have any flexibility, there's a kind of ugliness to a negative sort of fragility. There's a beautiful kind of fragility as well, which we could also talk about. Hubris. This is some of my, this is the denial of beauty. Hubris is a denial of beauty, self-aggrandization. Also self-reduction, becoming very small, making yourself small all the time. It's being tight and small. So both those things. Control. Control, like I was thinking of the difference between a Japanese garden and a Japanese Zen garden and let's say I live in France, and in France there's much beauty, but there's also this sort of imperial architecture, which is where you try to control the landscape. everything has to be under your control, and you try to control and dominate the landscape. So it's this kind of top-down thing, right? And in totalitarian societies, you see this, you see this imperial architecture, which is very, it has a power to it, but it's a negative kind of power, almost a satanic power, if I could say so. And the last thing I wrote for the denial of beauty was noise. It just pure noise. There's so much noisiness in our minds, not only outside, not only the ambient sound of a city, because you can find a quietude even in noise, right? A Zen master once told me, in Zen you find the silence in the noise, but just the noisiness of the culture is a denial, of beauty in my estimation. So the next thing, that's my list, which I wrote this morning about what is a denial of beauty, because I think we need to know what that is before we can approach what is beauty. And actually, we can't define beauty. I don't believe that we can define it. I don't think we should define it, actually. I think we should consider it a kind of, we should approach it with a sense of serious play. This is another one of John Vervaeke's terminology. So I'm not trying to define beauty here. I'm trying to give you propositions that you can play with. Some of them, come from, my own reflections, and many of them come from my reflections with people like John Vervaeke and Han. And Han says beauty is always has a sense of a veil. There's a veil to beauty, right? In other words, there's something hidden. It's not explicit. It's not all on the surface. That makes it deep, right? Which is the opposite of the kind of, pornification where you have, waxed bodies with their genitals exposed. That's not really beauty. That's probably the perversion of beauty. And again, I don't want to talk, in moralistic terms, but the erotic, for example, is when we say the erotic, we feel something very different than when we talk about porn. So what is erotic is this dynamic quality of beauty, I think, and this deeper quality of beauty, which is not explicit always, right? It eludes us, it tricks us, it's got a quality of being a bit of a trickster. I think that, the denial of beauty is also the denial of poetry. The poetry, and I don't mean poetry, just written poetry. I mean poetry, meaning a complex sense of language and a complex sense of, how we communicate with the world and how the world communicates with us, and how we create, we have a poetic manner or way or about a grace about us, which isn't necessarily poetry, but poetry is a primary form of beauty. And that reminds me, I was going to read this at the beginning because I had a girlfriend when I was in college, and she had this written on her mirror in red ink. And it's a quote by Rilke. And it says, "Beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, for which we are barely able to endure, and it amazes us so, because it serenely disdains to destroy us. Every angel is terrifying." Maybe you know that quote. I find the word "serenely disdains to destroy us" to be very interesting. Again, and I think after reading this on this person's mirror, and I've been reflecting. I reflected on me that why is there a terror to beauty? And I think it's something that I'll be thinking about the rest of my life. I don't think I could give you an answer to any of the questions, especially the question about what is beauty. The next thing I had written on my thing was elegance. And I think this is related to Stoicism, actually. So one of the reasons I think Stoicism is very popular these days is because it's taking a step back, right? From this pornification, from this instant gratification, from this, we've all turned into, addicts of some kind, and stoicism is taking a step back and saying we should be elegant, in our morality and in our disposition. The next part I had was wildness. So the elegance on one hand, and Nietzsche calls that the Apollonian. And then there's the Dionysian. And the Dionysian is this dynamic wildness, this elemental wildness, So if things become too stoic, become too contained, become too elegant, too contrived, we have to, in Vervaeke language, we have to break the frame, and experience some wildness. We have to allow chaos into our lives. We have to, have an orgy, or not a real orgy, but have maybe have just some kind of a, wild expression, of the Dionysian, which we need to experience that. That's an important experience to have, whatever that means. I'm not sure what that means in this culture, and I'm not sure if we experience that. Maybe in this kind of wild dance parties and whatnot. Okay. So I also wrote down, there's something vulnerable about beauty, not fragile, but vulnerable, right? That's a difference. So it's kind of a vulnerability, which is actually a form of strength. There's a complexity, right? There again, there's not a simple. It's not something simple. It's not complicated, right? Beauty is not complicated. We know what it is. We know, everybody knows what it is, even though we can't define it because it's complex. It's a deeply complex phenomenon, beauty, and that's why, again, it's the compass. Maybe at the same time you're on a stormy sea, and you don't necessarily know which way you're going. So it is the core and it is the compass, but we have to sort of keep unveiling these veils that are presented to us. And I guess the last thing I think I wrote, which was contrary to the idea of noise, is there's beauty emerges from silence, at least in my experience, as being somebody who's done a lot of Buddhist meditation. The moments where I've felt the most beauty have been in moments of intense presence and silence, and that could be in meditation retreat. It could be in a relationship with a person, but there's always a ground of silence contained, which contains that expression. So what else do I want to say about that? I think I've gone through my list. So what I perhaps could do right now is just open the conversation up to maybe, some, if what anything I've said has sparked any, have provoked you in any kind of way, or you think is true or not true, it's fine. I love the first two things that people said in this conversation, and I thought, geez, there's so many ways to look at this. It's almost infinite. So, beauty is the compass. That's a good one. The core. And again, the fact that, as Timothy says, this task that we have, and the culture is not responding, with any kind of elegance or any kind of beauty to what's going on. It's just increasingly noisy, and that's the last thing I want to say. It's what we're doing here is a resistance to that, and so resistance that's the revolutionary act of beauty, right? It's a resistance to that noise, to that denial of beauty. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew, for these questions, these ideas, provocations. I want to remind everyone that we're going to do a 30-minute sense-making round after this, so we can take these questions with us, go into breakout rooms, and expand on the conversation. So if you're available, I'd love for you to join us. And I do want to invite your questions or just, ideas, anything that you want to bring into this conversation. Go ahead, put it in the chat, and then I'll just call on people as it comes up to share. And I'm feeling inspired by this idea. Like, one of the things that I wrote down is that I'm rebelling against these parts of me that have been addicted to this immediate gratification and these facades of beauty. And I just appreciate that, the way you ended that, Andrew.
Yeah, addiction is perhaps another denial of beauty, right? It's how we
Right.
deny beauty, because beauty can be painful and put us in vulnerable situations. Yeah.
Timothy, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I wondered if, for me, I was thinking about, well, what is beauty for me? And it seems to somehow relate to authenticity, like when either I'm being deeply authentic or I experience somebody, something, a situation that has that deep authenticity. I don't know that there's any difference between that and what I perceive as beauty. I wondered what people thought about the relationship maybe between authenticity and beauty.
Yeah, but in authenticity is often, this is an abused term in some sense, at times, because just being authentic, right, all the time, is what a child does, right, on some level. So that's the perversion of this idea. I agree with what you're saying. What is truly authentic is beautiful. So I think that I think we grow into beauty. Like there's different stages of authenticity, and I think we always have to be beyond ourselves. We can't just be. There's something phony about authenticity if it's just remaining what it is. If it's not transcending itself. Does that make any sense?
Makes sense to me. It reminds me of like my youngest cousin my little cousin, when I'm playing with her and she's in all of her authenticity. She doesn't know that she's being authentic. She's being herself. And oftentimes I've put on like sort of a performance of authenticity. I've noticed that in myself. And I can sort of learn from her that I don't think she's learned how to do that yet. Jacob, would you share your inquiry here?
Yeah, so is beauty not just in the dimension of good? And if so, to talk about beauty is to moralize. And if that's not the case, why not?
That's an interesting question, and that's what I was talking to John about that actually, and he said wisdom is the virtue of or beauty is the virtue of wisdom. No, is that what he said? Beauty is the virtue of wisdom. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I agree with that statement in a way. In another way, I think beauty is beyond good and evil. So I want to put in the Nietzschean side there, because beauty drives you forward. It's like the sirens in the Odysseus, right? It can destroy you or make you anew. So there's some post morality beauty. I would say that there's an ethical component always to what is beautiful. And I would say ethics in Spinoza would say ethics is a more dynamic process than good, evil morality. Does that make sense?
We'd have to go long form to make sense of it, I think. But for now, sure. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
It's a good question to carry into the bonus round. Maybe Gray?
I liked that the concept of addiction got brought up. I do see that as one of the biggest denials of beauty that we see in our culture. And I just wondered if you could riff a bit about how we could resist addiction and get more beauty in that area of our lives.
Well, that's interesting. I was thinking about my experience during the COVID crisis and the fact that I didn't have to go to work. And I managed to tone down my addiction to television. I stopped watching so much television, and I think that helped me perceive the world better. So, I think I could see things better. So I think that's part of the, because there's so much entertainment, we could entertain ourselves to death, right? So it's stepping out. That's why Stoicism probably is so important right now, because it's stepping out of that, constantly salient, diversion. Well, I guess addiction is a contraction. It's a self-contraction, right? You just, you wallow in your inwardness, and you stop seeing the world, or you get hooked on all these experiences, and you stop seeing the small things. That's perhaps one way to look at it. It's a huge topic, addiction. I think, again, I'm quoting John Vervaeke because I've spoken to him a lot recently, and he talks about reciprocal narrowing. The world gets narrower and narrower and narrower the more addicted you are to things. On the other hand, there's a dynamic between our addictions and then wanting to break the frame, right? Like in the evening, I'll have a glass of wine because my mind is too contracted, and I want to a break out of. So you can ride the edge of your addictions a little bit, and that can be an interesting process. Because we all have addictions. I mean, we're addicted to coffee. We're addicted to there's 100% addiction in our culture. Basically, I haven't met a person that's not, addicted to something. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
Peter, will you ask your question about Stoicism?
I probably got Stoicism all wrong, because I'm not an expert, but
Join the club, my friend. So thank you, Tyson. So Andrew, you previously wrote, is Stoicism a ruse? What does a Stoic worship? Is Stoicism the religion that is not a religion? I love those juicy questions. So I was wondering if you can elaborate and maybe how that relates to beauty.
Yeah. Well, perhaps I could speak from the perspective of my own experience and tradition, which is, I'm a practitioner of Tantric Buddhism, and in Buddhism, you can divide Buddhism into, if you could divide it into all kinds of things, but you could divide it into sutra, which is the path of renunciation, which means giving up things. And I kind of think of that as being a Stoic activity, giving up things, like letting go of things. And letting go of all that. And then Tantra means that you move into the area where you confront energies directly. And you kind of, maybe that's the place beyond good and evil. Beyond, let's say, a fixed kind of morality. And I don't mean amorality. I don't mean, because you always have to have a good grounding in discipline before you can become an experimental person, an experimental artist. So I think for me, the Stoa feels like a pop culture version of Stoicism in a way, a very expansive version of Stoicism and a kind of sexy version of Stoicism, which I like, I think that's great. I don't know how it compares to how actual Stoicism was practiced back in the day. So if it's a ruse, it's a good ruse. Is that satisfying your your question, Peter, or do you want to?
I probably can talk to you about this all day, but I think that's good for now.
Okay.
Glenn, would you share what you shared in the chat?
Where's Glenn?
Yeah, sure.
I can't see Glenn. He's on the second page. Where's Glenn?
Yeah, we've just got an image of him in outer space.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
All right, perfect. So yeah, when you were talking about beauty, it reminded me of something that I heard Jordan Peterson talk about. And he made the point that you want to surround yourself with beauty because it is intimidating. And it basically holds up a mirror to all the things that are ugly, right? By having the ultimate form of say, beauty in front of you, it makes you self-reflect and realize where you're lacking in the standard that the artist is presenting in front of you. And I find that the artists that live right on the edge are staring dead in the face of beauty and ugliness. And they're able to come back from that edge and present to the public at large what they saw. And in doing that, when the public interacts with it, they see their own flaws and they see their own promise for potential. And I think that's the value of having art in your life. And I didn't realize the full potential of that until I just took that wisdom and applied it to my life and began putting a lot of art into my immediate space. And it makes you reassess everything that you do in the presence of something greater than yourself. And then I happened to see the documentary about Jordan Peterson and how his house is decorated, but by sheer massive pieces of artwork from a lot of the World War II and communist Russia time period. And he basically intimidates himself with beauty and the ugliness of beauty at the same time. And I just found that very powerful. So thank you for bringing it up. It was a very interesting topic.
Yeah, I like that. And what comes to mind is the sublime when you say that. And the sublime is always something, beyond you. And it's good. It's good to always be transcending. And if you surround yourself in beauty, there is a sense that the ugliness of the world becomes more stark, more evident. I agree with that. And so your life becomes, more difficult, actually. Beauty presents a difficulty. It's not, again, it's not a smoothness in the Hans sense of it. It presents a challenge to you. It's just like, when you're rejected in a relationship, you fall in love with somebody and then you just crash because you something, and then you start to say, okay, I have to find out who I am, and I have to, build myself up from scratch, and I have to meet that beauty somehow. We have to meet. It's something we need to meet on some level. And that's why it serenely disdains to annihilate us.
Yeah, it seems to force you to take the ultimate responsibility, right? And the more responsibility you take, the more difficult life can seem, but then actually you kind of transcend that difficulty through the responsibility. And on the other side seems to be this freedom, right? This freedom to then
on the other side
express.
Is the freedom of play, right? Which is
like
boundless beauty, which doesn't have reference points. There is a problem with the kind of, so I live in Paris, and sometimes I walk around the Louvre and there's these grandiose paintings and you feel crushed by them because they're so, and then you walk into the Impressionist area and you see Cézanne, and what Cézanne did is very interesting. The painter Paul Cézanne, who invented Impressionism, he was a classically trained painter, and he was trying to do this imposing form of beauty, right? He was trying to, he mastered all the classical techniques. And then he took all of his paintings and he put them in a bonfire and burnt them all, because he knew that he wasn't really creating beauty. He was creating an imitation, right? And then he came up with these mountains that have no perspective, and and they're just color, and he started to paint an interior landscape. He started to find his own sense of beauty, which wasn't in a hierarchical mode, right? It was beyond that somehow, and that was this creation of Impressionism, and which doesn't have that hierarchical sense. It's you can look at the mountain of Saint Victoire from all different angles, and see something. It's not a constricted landscape. There's a freedom to it. So I agree with what Peterson says, but that's the first step. I would say that's the Sutrianic step, if I can use Buddhist terminology, or the Stoic step.
Yeah, you remind me of kind of like what Carl Jung or J.R. Tolkien did. Like Tolkien said that he entered into the land of fairy, and he gave you the stories that he saw. And it seems that Jung entered the land of the unconsciousness, right? And he brought back the stories. So to your point, yeah, there seems to be something beyond that hierarchy that people want to fight in, right? It seems to be like this dominant culture ideal that you have to fight to be on the top. But it almost seems when you enter into this other liminal space that there is no more competition. It seems to be, hey, what are you seeing from your perspective, and let's share stories and see if we witness the same thing or not.
Vervaeke said that beauty is the sweet spot between suchness and moreness. And moreness is this expansive quality, right? You know, you go beyond yourself. You just, you know, it's too much, right? It's unbearable, right? In a sense, and it just keeps going and going and going and going, right? And then the suchness is the most intimate, the most near, the most domestic, the most it's on the earth, it's grounded. And so we're always going, you know, we always have to experiment with moreness, right? And then come down to suchness, and in, you know, in that dynamic, all ever dynamic process, you know, then we can become connected with something that we might be able to call beauty.
Yeah. So
David, would you share your question? Sorry, Glenn, didn't mean to.
Sorry, you wanted to finish what he was saying? So do you want to just continue?
Oh, sure. I was just going to say, I mean, that's a very good point, that you kind of have to reach out into chaos while you still keep 1 foot grounded. And sometimes you can fall 100% in the chaos. And the ones that seem to come back seem to be the wounded people that heal themselves. And they, throughout times, have been called shamans. And I think we need to see more and more of that kind of archaic revival, to take Terence McKenna's idea, and respect the archaic traditions that allowed human beings to reach the point where we're at right now. And I think diving into that space that you're talking about introduces a lot of people to what the ancients saw, and that we are now trying to rediscover and recreate. Thank you for letting me finish.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. David, I think this is a good time for your question and thoughts on transcendence.
Yeah, I actually noticed like my heart's pounding, and there's like all this aliveness in me, and like, oh, am I nervous? Am I excited? It's like I really care about this. And listening to you, Andrew, when you're like kind of gesturing towards beauty, like we can't really define it, you can kind of point towards it. I kept thinking of transcendence, or like the sacred, like beauty maybe is like getting a glimpse of the transcendent, and definitely like our culture seems to kind of obliterate the sacred through abstraction and, you know, commodification and all these things. And so I'm curious, in your world, what is the relationship between beauty and transcendence, or the sacred? Like, what's the difference?
Yeah, I had an interesting, again, I'm thinking of my conversation with Vervaeke about this, and he said the sacred, and I was thinking of René Girard, you know, who is he had this theory about the sacred. The sacred is often related to violence in some kind of a way. So there's two kinds of sacred. There's, you know, there's what is hidden. There's this hidden aspect of the sacred. And then I said, John, what I think it's not the sacred. I think you have to worship, right? That's a more direct relationship to what is divine, is to worship. Because if there's something sacred, then you have a distance from it a little bit. You're making it sacred. You're making it precious. You're not really there yet. On the other hand, he said, yeah, but it's like a fire. You need to have a distance from the fire. So that's an interesting discussion. And in terms of transcendence, there's two movements. There's transcendence, and then there's the immanence. So it's like breathing in and breathing out. You know, Trent, you always should be on the edge, right? So there's an edge to beauty, right? So that you're transcending yourself all the time. Yeah, but you should also be bringing that down to the most domestic, the most ordinary, the most real, making it real. So beauty has to be grounded in the real. That's why all this phantasmagorical images of beauty aren't necessarily beautiful. That's why the smooth isn't necessarily beautiful, or the pornographic, or because it hasn't been brought into I could say the heart on some level, if I can be prosaic about it. And there's this movie, I don't know if you know the movie Metropolis, and they talk about like the head and the hands need to join in the heart. So there's beauty is a meeting place, maybe. It's funny how this subject is so vast and infinite. You could just find different angles of it. There's no end to the importance of meditating on the beautiful, I think. And you don't come up with Platonic ideals. This is of, let's say, symmetry or something is beautiful, or asymmetry is beautiful, or whatever theory you have of beauty is kind of ends up to be bullshit, because it's beyond propositional knowing.
Lisa, if you'd like, maybe expand on your question about relationships.
Yeah, thank you, Tyson. I think what Andrew just said about the meeting place, that's what I got wondering about is beauty to goodness analogous to the moment of that meeting place, the encounter in that meeting place, versus any kind of critique of judgment or agency. I'm fascinated by this question about the distinction between truth and beauty. And I'm thinking a lot about time in this conversation. So the relationship to the relationship that we can only encounter in the moment.
Yeah. Well, I a few thoughts when you were speaking. That truth and beauty are not separate things, right? And often we associate truth with the masculine and beauty with the feminine, but then we have both those things inside of us, right? And they're not separate. That's one thought I had when you were speaking. And in terms of time, I say that beauty is it's completely I think I have a French word in my head, insaisissable. It can't be seized, it can't be captured, it can't be reduced to anything. It's always related to the relationship and in the moment in time, as you say. I think it's very much related to context and this living moment in time. And Heidegger talked about Dasein being in time, the beingness quality of time, and it's only alive and it only lives because it's going to reach its end. So there's a poignant quality to that, right? It's
Maybe Gray's comment reminds me of one of the questions that I woke up with this morning, which was something like, why beauty and why this conversation now, as I've been sort of, I feel like, forced to look at, in a good way, but forced to look at a lot of the suffering and the pain in the world that maybe before I was maybe a little naive to, or ignoring or distracted from. It's become more in my face. And so I was questioning myself and like, is this a sign of my privilege of I get to have a conversation about beauty, and kind of going down these thoughts, but then having these reminders come in about why this conversation and deepening this relationship is important to me right now. And so maybe I appreciate you asking this question. I'd love for you to share it.
So basically, why is beauty important right now? Like, as we have a sense that the world is sort of falling apart, and I would say that there's a temptation to live in this kind of space of propositional, ideological thinking, but it ends up being very counterproductive often.
Mm-hmm.
You just waste a lot of time thinking about, and watching the news and so I do think that beauty has a revolutionary aspect, but I don't think it's propositional. And I don't think we should deny it for any kind of social program, any kind of movement, any kind of ideology. I don't think we should deny it, because it is a compass. I think that was Timothy who said that at the beginning. It is a compass, and if we don't have that compass, we're lost.
Maybe would you like to expand on that at all or respond?
I like your name, Maybe. I think Maybe is a good name, because it's this, we don't know, right? We don't know what it is. It's perfect.
Yeah, anytime anybody qualifies their certainty, I'm like, what is that me? I think the only thing I would ask it as like a follow-up is does it feel brave to you to prioritize beauty? Does it ever feel hard? Is there anything you ever have to do to like psych yourself up to be like, no, beauty matters, I don't care what the haters say?
Well, it's because we have in our minds, weird ideas of beauty. It's always related to the cosmetic or the aesthetic or the cultural. But I think courage is inherent in beauty, and all these perennial notions. Like we were talking about Indra's net, right? Indra's net is like everything is reflected in everything else. So virtue is reflected in beauty, which is reflected in courage, which is reflected in wisdom, which is reflected in, they're all part of the, they're all part of this dynamic process, and it's a living, textured experience, well, I think maybe even politics could have an aspect of beauty if it was done right. It almost never is, right? And we can see that, what they call game A. When something becomes reified and it's a dead land. It's like it's the land of the dead, right? So yeah, I think I wouldn't want to limit beauty or poetry to any particular domain. I think politics, okay, it's not my thing so much, but other people I know are more involved in politics, and philosophy, whatever you do. If you're a waitress, you could do that with a certain kind of a beauty. If you're a, it's also related to a kind of style as well, somehow, and you can feel it when you're in the presence of that somehow. There's a coherence to it. That's Jordan Hall's term, but there's also a mystery. So it's not just coherence. It's not just, clarity, right? It's also mystery and depth and the shadowy, dimension.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any questions or inquiries, thoughts, final thoughts, ideas that you might want to leave us with as we go into breakout rooms and continue this conversation? Like any question or inquiry that is for you at the edge of your thinking now where we stand now, or just anything you might want to leave us with to consider and dialogue around.
Hey, Paul, I didn't see you there. No, I've just seen you now.
Did y'all hear me when I asked that question? Cool.
Paul was going to challenge my notion of beauty, but
I'm also open to us.
I like being challenged too. Challenge is good. Antagonism can be, there's a positive kind of antagonism. There's a positive kind of fight. I don't want beauty to be just soft and sweet and nice and, I learned that a lot from my podcast partner, Alexander Bard. He likes to get into fights, but he does it in a way where that's very respectful of other people at the same time. So. Is that your real name, maybe, Gray? Because gray is great too. Gray, I like the color gray. Gray is not usually considered to be a beautiful color, but Paris is gray is good because it's neither black nor white. It's this in between color. It's this liminal color. And we don't.
Yeah, it's my favorite color.
We don't often think of gray as being a beautiful color. We think of it as being kind of depressing. But there's millions of different shades of gray, right? To quote a famous movie, but. There's violet gray and green gray and red gray. Gray can reflect so many different things. So there's much beauty in gray. It's pouring rain outside now. It's gray with stormy skies. I love it.
Peter, before we do begin our next 30-minute session, you got to bounce. Do you have any closing words or invitations, or maybe even questions that you would like us as the Stoa to take into this sense-making session?
Okay, that's a good question. First, Andrew, thank you, my friend, for coming to the Stoa today.
Thanks so much.
And thank you for our sexy and beautiful MC of the evening, Tyson Wagner, for launching this new series with us. Yeah, I do have a question that I could leave everyone off with, but I'll plug a few announcements or events, invitations, as Tyson put it. So we have a wisdom gym here at the Stoa. And we have 2 events coming up today. Relational Exegesis with Jessica. That's every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And we basically read a text together. So we build a relationship with the text while we're building communitas with each other. That's been pretty fun. And then we have a shame breakthrough boot camp with our shame educator, AJ Bond. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And he takes us through all these different exercises. And I highly recommend that. Then we have a couple of really cool one-off sessions. Brent Cooper, that meta-modern troublemaker, is coming in to doing a session called Who's Sensing the Sense Makers this Friday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. And he's just basically going to criticize all of us. And then we can criticize him back. And then we have James fucking Kars, author of Finite Infinite Games. He's having a session playing the infinite game during a meta crisis. That's June 17th. I think this is a Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So definitely check out all that. And the question I will leave, the one that I'm wondering about, and you can wonder about too, is how do we make the Stoa the most beautiful place possible? Or digital campfires like the Stoa? That being said, I'll take Tyson back in.
Thank you, Peter. By quick show of hands, who is going to stay the next 30 minutes for breakout rooms? Okay, good. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for being here and bringing this conversation to the Stoa. I look forward to continuing it, and maybe as things evolve and unfold and we all continue this conversation, we can have you back another time in the future. And you're always welcome here around the campfire for any session. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was a lot of fun.
All right, so anybody that has to go now, you may do so. And then for the rest of you, I will start organizing breakout rooms in a minute or two. So if you want to take a quick break or anything, feel free to do so.